worked as a UX designer, first in startups and later at big companies like Shopify, which for me, honestly, was kind of a dream role. And after almost 6 years as a product designer, I decided to walk away. So I want to talk a bit about what led up to this, how I made this decision, and I'll also talk a bit about what I switched to. So not to spoil the ending, but I now have my own design business doing something that I'd say draws heavily from the skills I learned as a product designer. But personally, I'm a lot happier doing what I do now than I was working full-time in tech. And to be transparent, I've gotten to the point where I'm able to earn more as well. So I want to explain this whole backstory. And if you're also thinking about whether to stay on the UX path or if you're dealing with UX burnout, which I've been hearing kind of a lot about recently, then I'll offer a few hopefully helpful things for you to consider. So one of the biggest things that ultimately led to my exit from UX was a frustration that grew over the years over what I can best describe as a kind of lack of control. So the reality is, at ambitious, high-growth tech companies, which is where some of the most competitive UX jobs tend to be, you have to be ready to be a real team player. So you need to follow the systems, you need to work with your assigned team to drop one thing and reprioritize another. And for the sake of efficiency in a big organization, this makes complete sense. But I think that for people who like to kind of do things their own way, these kinds of environments can be frustrating at times. And I also felt that this kind of ideal UX process that we're taught, this empowered product team model, is in reality just not what the majority of projects look like, with so many moving parts and people and variables. So even on really high-performing teams, you need a lot of patience for just rolling with the punches when it comes to reorgs and paused projects and layoffs. It can be a lot, especially if you're someone like me who by nature, I just like to feel as though I'm in the driver's seat, and needing to be so flexible and tolerant all the time can kind of wear you down. So years of frustration kind of built up, and after I'd experienced some similar patterns across various different teams and organizations, I reached a bit of a breaking point and felt like something needed to change. I just didn't know exactly what at first. So when I realized that I was feeling pretty discouraged or even a bit jaded in a way that was kind of impacting my life and my ability to show up and do well at my job, my first instinct was to kind of try getting my mojo back. Maybe you've done the same. So I started ordering so many new design books. I signed up for different courses to level up different skills. I started following a bunch of UX leaders, and I figured this might help me kind of break through my block. And I will say this worked a bit. I would definitely suggest this as a starting point if you're feeling UX burnout. However, I ultimately felt like this root feeling that I was struggling with, just this kind of general misalignment between what I wanted out of work versus the reality of what I was getting in a career in UX, it didn't really go away. So this is where, if I hadn't already worked in UX for almost 6 years, I likely would have considered joining a new company or maybe moving to a different team or product internally. However, after thinking about it, I realized that during my career, I had actually worked on a super diverse range of different companies and products. So big enterprises and scrappy small startups. I had designed very technical B2B products, as well as more shiny consumer-facing interfaces. And I think that realizing this forced me to be honest with myself that the kind of change I was probably looking for went beyond just the type that you get when you switch companies or teams. As I was grappling with all of this, one thing that ended up being really helpful for me was this particular podcast episode by Suzy Welch. So I love this whole podcast, but this particular episode was kind of a massive aha breakthrough for me. And long story short, Suzy Welch talks about this set of 15 values that we all have in varying degrees. I'll show them here. Some of them have kind of unusual names, but if you listen to the episode, she defines them very clearly. But by evaluating how important or not important each of these is to you, the idea is that you'll get massive clues about the types of careers, roles, life paths that likely will or will not work well for you. So when I went through this list, 2 values really stood out for me. I scored extremely high, like maybe abnormally high, for agency, as in independence, liking to do things my own way, as well as scope. And as she defines it, scope is loving variety and wanting big experiences, not being at all afraid of risk or change. So having this framework was very clarifying and even kind of emotional for me because, truth be told, I had felt a bit like something was just wrong with me, or that I was ungrateful because of the fact that I just couldn't seem to be satisfied in these great UX roles, the type that in design school and in the UX world we're really told are great jobs to get, and I had worked my way towards them for so long. So having this new vocabulary helped me feel a lot less crazy and less guilty, and it made me realize that for whatever reason, I am just born into this world with very high agency and very high scope, among other things. Everyone is very different across the board on these, and thank God that they are, because the world needs people doing all kinds of different jobs. But the point is, I would give this a listen. I guess you probably know what's coming here, but ultimately where all of this led is that I realized I wanted to leave the conventional full-time UX path and apply the skills that I had developed as a product designer to something different. I decided to double down on something that I had done on and off over the years that combined some aspects of UX that I really did love, as well as some new skills that I didn't get to do much of in UX roles at tech companies. And this was starting a business specialized in designing and building websites, mostly for startups, but really for a whole range of small and mid-sized businesses. And this type of work is closely related to UX. I would say it's UX adjacent for sure, but like I mentioned, it involved a whole new set of skills that I just got so excited about. I got to start doing more visual design and branding work again. I had to tackle the challenge of finding clients and getting better at sales. I learned to hire and manage subcontractors, etc., etc. So starting my own business opened up a massive amount of scope in my life, and all of a sudden I had the agency to move as fast and creatively as I wanted. And to be clear, all of this was hard. I don't want to overly glamorize starting your own business or a freelance operation. There is a lot of admin and mundane, stressful parts of it, and that's kind of true for any job. But for me, the trade-offs were so much more in favor of things that felt energizing and exciting to me. Overall, I'd say this really reinvigorated me and brought back my excitement about work in a way that bouncing around in UX jobs never quite did. All right, there's a quick side note that I feel I need to mention here. And this is kind of a life circumstance thing that contributed to the timing of this whole journey. And this is that in 2022, I relocated from the US to living here in Spain. I was not joking around when I said I like big scope. And the reason that this is relevant is that maybe you're aware of this, but salaries in Europe are lower than in the US. So if I was going to stay in a full-time role and live in Spain, that meant my income would be a lot lower than it was when I was in the US. So while I wouldn't say that this was the determining factor in all of this, it definitely expedited things, I would say, because from a longer term perspective, even though starting your own business is hard, I knew that if I formed a business in the US where my whole network and professional life have always been based, I would be able to earn more than if I was working in the EU with a full-time localized salary. I wasn't even going to mention this in this video because this circumstance is so specific to me and my life, but I think the reality is that whatever it is, we all have some specific circumstance that factors into our decision making. So this was that big kind of wild card factor for me, and without mentioning it, I didn't really feel like you would have the full picture. So now you do. All right, so a few conclusions and small pieces of advice, which you can take with a grain of salt. Since starting my own business, I have personally been very surprised by how well product design sets you up to run a business, whether that's a kind of freelance operation like what I'm doing, or even something really different. But if you think about it, as UXers, we're taught to really think about people's end-to-end experiences. So for me, the clients, we are conditioned to seek out feedback and then figure out how to integrate that. We're taught to always have a process that we're following, but we're also conditioned to be very flexible and improvisational. So these are exactly many of the same skills that you use when you're creating a business. And to be clear, I would never push someone towards this path unless it's something you truly gravitate towards, because it is so much work and it can be so stressful. So what you gain in variety and autonomy, you do kind of give up, at least in the short term, in comfort and predictability, right? Who doesn't love those steady paychecks and those nice benefits? But like I spoke about before, this is where I think that spending some time really reflecting on your values can be so clarifying. And I wish I had done that a lot sooner, because I think what can happen when you're trying to make a big decision, like what career to go into or to switch out of, if you're like me and you're kind of an external processor who likes to talk through things with friends and family, you can encounter very well-meaning people who want to help, but who ultimately give you advice or input really through the lens of their values. And they don't always consider the fact that yours might be really different. And I actually do think this can be kind of a difficult and even painful thing, especially in families, right? Like a parent might really value affluence or achievement, and a kid might really value impact or self-expression. And nobody is wrong per se when someone says that X, Y, and Z are the most important things. It's just that they're the most important things to them. So anyways, the point is, I think this is something to be a little bit cautious and mindful of. If you're struggling with UX burnout or wondering whether you should stay in UX or switch to something else, you are not alone, and just know that there is a path forward. I will be sharing more real talk on navigating design careers, so hit subscribe, and if you have specific questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I'm going to try to answer them in future videos. Also, if you're still listening right now, I'm so appreciative. This has been a lot. See you next time.